Charliecrimebuster here. Today we're going to update you on the Chad Daybell trial. We're going to call this episode The Gravedigger's Murder Graveyard. You're going to hear all about that and a whole lot more on this episode of Charliecrimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals interviewed and participating in this show and do not represent those of Charliecrimebuster nor Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to today's program. Glad to have you a part of the Charlie Crime Train today. Hey, we want to especially welcome you who are first-time listeners. We always appreciate the many people who download the episodes. And if you're a first-time listener, we'd like to invite you to reach out with a shout-out. You can reach me, Charliecrimebuster, at gmail.com. That's Charliecrimebuster at gmail.com. Go ahead, reach out with a shout-out. Maybe you have questions. Maybe you have suggestions of other podcasts you'd like to hear from us. Or maybe you just like to lodge in an objection that you just don't agree with what we're saying. It is a safe spot, so go ahead and reach out with that shout out. Again, Charliecrimebuster at gmail.com. Also, if you like to support the program, go to peacemakernetwork.com, peacemakernetwork.com. There you'll read about the brave men and women of law enforcement, the first responders, and the military. And you can be a part of us helping them. Your support will not only help the podcast, but it also help these brave heroes. And then if you'd like to get caught up on any of the episodes, feel free to go right over to our website, charliecrimebuster.com. There is a whole bunch of episodes there for you to get caught up on. Hey, by the way, if you would, make sure you subscribe to today's podcast so that you can have our weekly podcast right after they are published. Again, thank you for being a part of the Charlie Crime Train today. Well, today we're going to be talking about Chad Daybell. Some really interesting things have happened this past week. One of the things I did want to bring to your attention, though, is this thing about Tammy Daybell. You see, it seems like the last couple of weeks there's been a whole lot of time spent by the prosecution to remind us that Tammy Daybell was in superior health whenever she died. You see, it is the defense approach is that she died of a natural death. But we have seen witness after witness come to the witness stand. And I was especially impressed with those who perhaps were the last people to see and talk to Tammy on the day before the night that she died. Yep, the prosecutor took those people and brought them to the stand. People who saw her on that Friday afternoon, that fateful Friday afternoon into that weekend where she died. And they all expressed astonishment. They were shocked. And they all continued to say that Tammy was in great health, that her spirits was good. There wasn't anything like what Chad had told the investigators about her health. And then, even prior to this, there were those who came who testified who had been a part of Tammy's exercise class. And it wasn't just any exercise class. This wasn't just some kind of yoga deal where you sit down on a mat. This was intense exercising. And those who were a part of the class were all saying that Tammy was right on top of it. Hey, she was even taking a clogging class, So she was very active. She was preparing to run a marathon. All of these things was taking place in her life, and so there wasn't a real excuse, or I would say a real reason why she should die naturally in her sleep. Well, we know now that more than likely it is alleged that Alex Cox was in the area. And if you have followed the podcast so far, you know that we have told you all about Alex Cox, right? You see, Alex Cox is Lori's spiritual hitman. Both Chad and Lori had manipulated Alex into thinking that he was doing God's work by getting rid of dark spirits. You see, people, according to them, or according to Chad and his hierarchy as he shared it with his followers, There were people who had a contract with Christ prior to coming to this earth, and they were the light spirits. Then there were those who had a contract with the devil prior to coming on the earth, and they were the dark spirits. And when you became completely dark, well, the only way to escape, the only way to make something happen is for that life to go away and for that body to be taken care of so that the spirit then could depart. And so with all of this manipulation, they manipulated this guy by the name of Alex Cox, who happened to be Lori Vallows Daybell's brother. He was the protector. He was the spiritual hitman. And as you've been following this trial, it's already proven that he was the one who took a shot, well, actually, at Melody, who happened to be Lori's niece. It was her estranged husband. They were going through a divorce. They were fighting for custody. So something happens. Well, of course, Chad pronounced him, Brandon Bordeaux. He pronounced that his spirit had gone dark. And so who comes to the rescue? Well, none other than Alex Cox. He actually drives Charles Vallows' Jeep to the place where Brandon was living, set up on him. Brandon's coming back from working out. He takes a shot at him. Well, thank God he wasn't that good of a shot. But boy, it was close. It hit there, right there at the door frame, right there above Brandon's head. But he missed. Brandon survived. Now, this is the same spiritual hitman that took a crack at Tammy Daybell even prior to the day she died. Just a few days prior to that, she pulls up into the driveway. She's bringing her groceries home. And this guy, dressed in black with a mask on, shoots at her or tries to shoot at her. She thinks it's a paintball gun, but I guarantee you, my friend, it wasn't a paintball gun. Sometimes rifles can look like that, and this one looked like that. They even found, when they did a search warrant, and they found some of Alex's gun, they found the gun that easily could be identified by some as a paintball gun. But see, that gun malfunctioned. And so she told the police about it. But a few days later, mysteriously, she dies in her sleep. At first, they all thought it was natural causes, And Chad, he did not want an autopsy. Nope. He wanted her to be taken care of as soon as possible. He wanted to do the funeral, wanted to do the memorial service, everything. Get it done with. Get her put in the ground and put away. But when all this other stuff came to the front, then they exhumed her body. You remember that. Dug her up, and they brought a real medical examiner in to look at the body. Now, a coroner had already looked at her after she died, but these coroners were not near as experienced as this medical examiner was. They had not seen near the deaths that this medical examiner did. And as this medical examiner, as they exhumed her body, he actually could see a couple of things that was very alarming. First of all, he said that she died of asphyxiation. In other words, she was smothered. He also pointed out that there were recent bruises, that could indicate that somebody had held her down while they smothered her. Now, remember that word smother, because I'm going to tell you something else when we get into the place where we talk about the gravedigger's graveyard, his murder graveyard. You're going to see something that's going to relate to this idea that Tammy was smothered. Now, the thing that's so incredible about this is that up to this time, everything that I've reviewed about this case and everything that people sees about this case, it appears that Alex Cox is the one who's doing the dirty business. He's the one that's going wet, as they say in crime world. He's the one that's getting down and dirty. He's the one that's doing the killing. But wait a minute. If that examiner is right, that someone held her down while another person smothered her, who was the other person in that house that night that Tammy Daybell died? Well, it was none other than the gravedigger himself, Chad Daybell, this prophet of doom, this false prophet, this prophet who is a wolf and in sheep's clothing. This guy, if the medical examiner is correct, this guy himself stood by in the same room and helped smother Tammy Daybell to death. Now, you think that's startling? You think you're thinking to yourself, how could somebody be so evil? My friend, when we begin to talk in a moment about the grave digger's graveyard, well, as we say up in Tennessee where I'm from, you ain't seen nothing yet. You think it was bold that someone would be as cruel as to stand by and help kill his own wife who stood by him faithfully through those years? Well, you wait till you hear. Wait till you hear what happened as they found those children's bodies there in the gravedigger's graveyard. We're going to tell you all about that in a minute, but right now it's time for us to take time out, and we do what we call a Crazy Crook story. It helps us kind of lighten the load of some of the heavy stuff that we are sharing. So right now, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. We're going to talk about, among other things, the gravedigger's graveyard. We'll be there in just a moment, but right now it is time for Charliecrimebuster's Crazy Crook Story of the Week. Well, friend, our Crazy Crook story today, well, it comes from the state of Colorado. You see, it seems there was a suspect. He was left running from an e-cigarette shop in Colorado. Well, as often these crazy crooks do, it was a botched robbery. Now, the security camera footage shows a man walking into the store on September the 2nd. He was attempting to take out what police later said, was a replica handgun. But instead, this crazy crook, he's so nervous, I guess, the weapon ends up flying over the counter. And it is, of course, a BB gun with the orange tip removed. It fell on the floor, and then the clerk grabbed it. That's what Aurora police said in a Facebook post. Now, video, it does capture the surprise on the suspect's face as the gun makes its way over the counter. Well, then the suspect attempts to climb over the counter, but then when he realizes, the other guy's got the gun, he changes his mind, and he runs out the door. Now, that would be crazy enough about this crazy crook. But then, my friend, get this, hang on to it. He is then seen on the video losing his pants before it goes off screen. And then the clerk goes to the door, appears to lock it. And, of course, the police, they have released the video in hopes of identifying this crazy crook. So, my friend, this crazy crook who started to rob a store with a fake gun, couldn't even hold it in his hand, and it slipped out of his hand. Then he decides to get away and runs out the door, but he had baggy pants on. He lost his pants. Well, my friend, this crazy crook in Colorado becomes Charliecrimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Okay, my friend, now back to our main focus. We've been talking, of course, about Tammy, but our focus today is going to be on the Gravedigger's Murder Graveyard, and we're going to be telling you about that. But let me go back and recap a little bit about this thing about Tammy. The defense is trying to say that she was in perfect health. Witness after witness after witness after witness has come to the stands these past weeks and have testified of Tammy's good health. More importantly, the medical examiner, who, as I told you a few moments ago, had ruled that her death was homicide, and that she was asphyxiated, she was smothered to death, and that someone had held her down. Even he, in looking at her autopsy, will say that this lady was in good health. There was no reason for her to naturally die at such a young age. So I got to tell you, my friend, I believe that the prosecution is knocking a home run in convincing the jury that Tammy was in good health and this was not a natural death. One of the witnesses said that Tammy had said she felt better than she ever felt in her life. She was preparing to run a marathon. And just a few days before that, just a few days before that, someone had tried to take her out. She thought somebody was joking around with a paint gun, but unfortunately, it was the spiritual hitman himself. They knew he was in the area. They could trace him there. He had tried to shoot her, and when that didn't work, it appears allegedly that her killers was Alex Cox, and he had to have help if somebody held her down while someone else smothered her. It could be none other than Chad Daybell. So I believe the defense, they have a really, really big case against them if they're going to disprove this fact. And it's not looking good for them to try to say that she just died of a natural death. In fact, the only people that are mentioning anything about health complications, it's people who are trying to save their own skin and trying to save their father. It's the family, of course. And there's just too many people who've testified otherwise, and the evidence and the autopsy, it appears, my friend, that no doubt about it, she was murdered. Now we're going to talk about that murder's graveyard. But before we do that, there was something else that came up that some people are probably wondering about. That is, they brought up again the death of Charles Vallow. Now, Charles Vallow, remember, Chad and Lori were involved in this relationship. Both of them were married at the time. Chad to Tammy, that we just talked about her death. And then there is Charles Vallow. That was Lori's husband. Both of them were married to someone else during the time of this relationship that they had, this affair that they had. Now, Charles Vallow, interesting enough, Charles Vallow actually predicted his death. You see, he had already called officials. He had already called the police and said, something's wrong here. My wife is saying that I have a dark spirit. My wife is saying that she's going to get rid of me. He already feared for his life. And Charles had attempted to get Lori some help, to get her to some help with some mental counseling, to get her put away to a place where she could perhaps get this out of her mind. But, of course, Lori, she was a very manipulative person, and she swayed the authorities that there was nothing wrong with her. So Charles and Lori are estranged. They're separated. Charles is coming to pick up little JJ, the little boy, and take him to school. When he pulls in that day, interesting enough, he had told somebody else about that, and they had warned him to be careful. But when he walked into Lori's home there in Arizona at this point, he is shot and killed. Now, Alex and Lori says that Lori and Charles got into a heated argument. Charles picked up a baseball bat when her brother stepped in between them. Her brother Alex says that he hit him with a baseball bat, that Charles hit Alex with a baseball bat, that then Alex went into his room, picked up a weapon, and came out and shot him dead. Well, as with all these things of Lori Vallow, we're finding that this is not true. Evidence now tells us that he was indeed shot, but after he was shot, no one called 911 right away, not at all. You see, Alex Cox shot Charles Vallow. He was laying on the floor for 43 minutes. 43 minutes before 911 was called. And during that 43 minutes, his wife, Lori, she took the kids, went to Burger King, got breakfast, then went to Walgreens, picked up some flip-flops, dropped little JJ off to school, and came back just as though nothing had ever happened. It was just another day in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Charles is bleeding out on the floor. Let me tell you something. If Charles Vallow had taken a baseball bat to Alex Cox, it wouldn't be just a little scratch on his head. Be a whole lot more than that. No, my friend, this was an ambush. They had already spoken to other people by text messages and told people, Lori had, it's going to come to a head this weekend. We're going to take care of this weekend. And they did take care of it. They shot, murdered Charles Vallow on the floor there in the house. He died bleeding out. Alex told dispatchers he had just shot him, but that was 43 minutes later. He told dispatchers he tried to save him. He didn't touch him. Nope, didn't touch him. Just waited for him to bleed out. So there you have it. Both of these spouses have now been eliminated. And guess what? Both of these spouses had life insurance. Lori thought she was going to get the $1 million from Charles, but Charles had changed the beneficiary just before to his sister. And Chad did get like $300,000 or $400,000 regarding Tammy's death. And so they're just going to go to Hawaii. But now there's something else. There's other people involved that are still keeping them from what they want to do with their lives. And it comes to the children. Little JJ. And, of course, Tylee. And that brings us to the grave diggers murder graveyard. And I'm going to tell you all about that in a moment. But right now it's time for us to give you some news that you can use. This news that you can use is another break that we take in the program to help you to be, well, try to help you be a little safer in this life. So here is James Buckland, our producer, with news you can use.
Military personnel are more likely to make a suicide attempt or die by suicide if they are experiencing intense emotional pain. This could include depression and trauma, such as post-traumatic stress. Risk for suicide increases when military personnel experience both depression and post-traumatic stress together. They experience things like hopelessness or perceived burdensomeness, self-hatred, unbearability, guilt, and even some disconnectedness. They'll say things like this: things will never going to change. It's always going to be the same. Or, you all would be better off without me. Or comments like this: I'm worthless and there's nothing good about me. Or even, this is terrible, I just can't take it anymore. Or, it's all my fault. And then this one: no one values me or cares about me. You see that last one? No one values me or cares about me. This is what Peacemaker Network is all about. We do care. We do value our first responders, law enforcement personnel, and military, and this is why we shine our light on PTSD and suicide awareness. We need our heroes healthy, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Join the Peacemaker Network today. PeacemakerNetwork.com.
Thank you, James. As usual, you're right on target. All right, now we're going to talk about the grave diggers murder graveyard. There on Chad Daybell's property, there was a pet cemetery. On a particular date, Chad had texted his wife, Tammy, who was alive at that point, and said that he had been outside and he saw a raccoon and he shot that raccoon and he buried that raccoon there near the pet cemetery. He also said that he was cleaning up the shrubbery before a storm, so there was a fire. Sounds innocent enough, does it not? Except for the fact that after Charles had been killed, the public became aware that the two children, little JJ, 7 years of age, Tylee, 16, turning 17, were now missing. Police went to check, a welfare check on little JJ. They could not find him. And meanwhile, Chad, just 2 weeks after Tammy had died, he married Lori and they went to Hawaii. That's where they had the wedding. And now they're in Hawaii and the children are all missing. But the cops, the police officers, through great investigation skills, they begin to find the last time that anybody remembered seeing these children alive. They took that date and zeroed in on that date, and then they did something that is very, very common in today's investigation. They followed the cell phone. We have them with us, don't we? They go everywhere we go. Follow the cell phone. So they begin to follow the cell phone of the spiritual hitman, Alex Cox. And they find it right there on Chad Daybell's property. Yep, you guessed it. Right back there to where that pet cemetery was. And they began to meticulously go through the gravedigger's graveyard. Now, I call him the gravedigger because Chad Daybell was actually a sexton. He was literally a gravedigger in his life. Wrote books and dug graves. But his spiritual hitman was digging graves on his graveyard in his pet cemetery. And the graves that he was digging, unfortunately, was the graves of these children who had been murdered. And my friends, some of the most gruesome testimony of this trial up to this point was when those officers got on the stand, along with the medical examiner who did the autopsy on these children, and told about what they saw. They talked about little JJ, who they found buried. He had been wrapped in plastic. There had been plastic over his head. There was tape over his mouth and his nose. And he was still in his little pajamas that people remember last seeing him in. And this little boy was murdered and buried out there like a dog in a pet cemetery. And then they talked about little Tylee, this precious teenager, 16 years of age. How she, well, I hate to even tell it. I hate to even talk about it. But they found her in bits and pieces. Yep, bits and pieces. Because they had not only dismembered her body, but had burned her body. And so there was just bits and pieces. And she was brought to the autopsy table in buckets. Sad, isn't it? Isn't it sad that it got to this point? And yet that's exactly what happened. And while that was going on, Chad had already prepared his wife in case somebody looked and saw that the soil had been disturbed where the children had been buried. He had already prepared her by saying the reason there was a fire down there was we were burning shrubbery, when in fact, that was not the fact. The fact was those children were buried. The body was burned by the spiritual hitman. And did Chad know about it? Of course he did. Of course he did. That's why he set up the alibi about shooting a raccoon and about the fire there. Of course he did. That's why when he saw them, that the police were zeroing in, he called Lori immediately. You could hear it in his voice. They're back there. They're back on the property. That's why he told his daughter that he would be gone a long, long time. That's why he told his daughter that the neighbors would be talking about it. Yep, the gravedigger in his own backyard, his own graveyard, became a graveyard of murder with these two precious lives. Well, that's where we are right now. Now it's all come out on the stand. And pretty soon it's going to be time for the defense to put on their case. How Pryor's going to defend this? Boy, I don't know. He's good. His cross-examination has been great as far as his skill as a lawyer. But even the greatest lawyer on earth, I don't think, can get Chad Daybell out of the grave that he put himself in by becoming a part of this conspiracy that cost the life of not only their spouses, Tammy Daybell, Charles Vallow, but the lives of these precious children, J.J. Vallow, little Tylee Ryan. These lives are now non-existent on earth because of the destructive behavior of Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow. Well, we're yet to see. And remember, on this trial, other than Lori's already been found guilty. She's going to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Thank God, that's where she needs to stay. But on this trial, there is the death penalty. And what will happen then? Well, lots more to happen. Hey, by the way, let me remind you that on Tuesday nights now, we have launched a YouTube channel where we talk again about the things that we share on the podcast. I invite you to be a part of it. Go to YouTube and then /CharlieCrimebuster, YouTube at Charliecrimebuster, and you'll find us there. Hey, we're going to leave a link to that in the show notes. Also a link for you to reach out with a shout out. Also a link for you to go to peacemakernetwork.com, and a link for you to go to more episodes, and a link for you to go to the YouTube channel. Be sure and check the show notes. So until this time, next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, stay safe, stay alert. Yep, for the life you save, it could be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com, or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @CharlieCrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/CharlieCrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.